leftover motorway that they, didn't affect anybody, didn't have to move any car parks for, and they attached it to a cycle path at the other end, so it's not that flash, to be honest. And you know what? If you voted for no rates rise, cycleways are going to stop. That's the end of that progress.
All right, so stop the cycleways is what Alexia's saying.
I'm certainly not saying that. I'm all in favour of cycleways, but, this is all tied into lack of money that councils are facing now, that they'll sack their planners because people are baying for overpriced, workers to be gone, and this is the sort of result.
Build it and they will come. I don't know. What about you, Mike? I jumped on my bike quite a bit during the lockdown to come to work because couldn't really take the bus and don't have a car. Well, my wife has a car. I don't. So hopped on the bike and actually found it quite a good way to get to work. And gosh, you got quite fit as well. What do you think about this?
Oh, absolutely. Bikes are the future, definitely. The era of individual car ownership, maintenance, clogging up the motorways, the traffic jams, the car parking, the expense, the buildings dedicated to stacks and rows and rows and rows of car. So, that's kind of like yesterday's fish and chips now. The future is in alternative means of transport that don't include the combustion, individual ownership of the combustion engine vehicles, and bikes are very much part of that. I'd like to see us dig up all our inner city roads, plant them in fruit trees and grass, and have whether or not it's scooters or bikes or electric light rail or sky trains or whatever the case may be. But I reckon we ought to just completely ban vehicles from the inner cities. That's just a nightmare.
That just sounds like some would say, listen to this, just total extremist talk, Mike. Never going to happen.
It is going to happen. They said the people that rode horses said that when Henry Ford invented the car. They all went, that ain't going to happen. It's just crazy. We're going to ride horses forever. It didn't happen. There's going to be a technological kind of leap, and as far out as that may seem today, let me tell you, Elon Musk is beavering away in the United States, just cranking the future out at a great rate of knots. And pretty soon we're going to have driverless cars. I can't wait for it. I'm going to be sitting in the back of my car with my guitar and a beer, and I'm going to be singing all the way home while the artificial intelligence computer safely navigates me all the way back to where I need to go. And that's just a fantastic vision. I hope I lived long enough to be able to do that.
Alexia's rolling her eyes here. So Mike's part of the future, and you're part of the past, Alexia.
Yeah,
you're part of the past.
No, I think maybe it's because my husband's a tradie, but I can't imagine him getting onto a bus with a tub of jib and a couple of sheets of board under his arm and going into the city to do a repair.
Has he tried?
Well, no, he hasn't, funnily enough. No, there's going to have to always be some kind of access for couriers.
There's always a solution. Do you know that these days you can buy an electric bike and there's little trailers with the sort of tarpaulin over the top? Why not? Why can't you try that?
Gosh, I can see them all doing that, leaping on that bandwagon. No.
Yeah, but there's going to be exceptions, of course. But you must admit, you must have driven down the motorway and just seen the cars streaming in both directions, one person per vehicle, no jib sight, and no jib in sight for miles.
I watch from the window of my double-decker bus on the busway.
Meanwhile, I hope you get your car fixed, Mike. Thanks for joining us, Mike Smith there and Alexia Russell. See you back tomorrow, 3:45.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Haere aki nei, garages are for cars, aren't they? So why is a mother and her two children, one of them severely disabled and in a wheelchair, living in one in South Auckland? How well is social housing catering for our most vulnerable? We ask a minister. Australia's warning its borders could be locked down till next year, but tourism operators here say it's a trans-Tasman bubble or bust for some of them. People are waiting up to 4 hours to get COVID tests after recent cases prompt a rush. How much are returning Kiwis prepared to pay for 14 days isolation in a luxury hotel with 3 squares a day? And effective immediately, the government unveils a new testing regime for border, airport workers and cabin crew.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. No mai, hi to mai. Good afternoon. I'm Paul Brennan. The government says nothing is off the table as it seeks to restore public confidence in the COVID-19 border regime. A review of all quarantine and isolation facilities was ordered after it became apparent not everyone was being tested for the virus before being released, and a report is due back this week. The Minister in charge, Megan Woods, says New Zealand's border rules are already among the strictest in the world.
Changes are already being made, that our facilities are already making sure we're adhering to the procedures that were there, that they are being followed, and those in our facilities are taking responsibility, but we're willing to look at anything that strengthens it.
Megan Woods, and under a new plan just announced, border workers and aircrew are to be swabbed more for COVID-19, even if they don't have symptoms. The Health Minister, David Clark, says border staff are now the priority for testing because the biggest coronavirus risk is from New Zealanders returning from global hotspots. Dr Clark also says district health boards will have to draw up plans to make sure they can keep up with national testing rates and reach all communities. The Director-General of Health has defended the integrity of managed isolation facilities, saying they're not cocktail parties or wedding receptions. Ashley Bloomfield has confirmed his ministry is still following up 2,159 people who left managed isolation between June the 9th and 16th. He says he can't say how many left without being tested, but he's adamant they posed a very low risk to the community.
A, they've completed the 14 days, and B, they are in managed isolation. And I know there have been a lot of stories about so-called mixing and mingling, which sounds like it's a wedding reception or a cocktail party. That is not the circumstances in these facilities.
Ashley Bloomfield. Another 2 cases of COVID-19 have been reported today, both men in their 20s returning from India and the United States. The senior New Zealand First Minister, Shane Jones, has accused National of scaremongering and spreading false claims about a homeless person sneaking into an isolation hotel. The National MP, Michael Woodhouse, last week said a homeless man had bluffed his way into a 5-star hotel for a 14-day stay. Mr Jones says it's poor form from the opposition.
It's a shallow attempt to spread fear and confusion, and now the asset is on the MP to stack up that apocryphal story.
Shane Jones. However, Michael Woodhouse says he stands by what he said last week. He says his highly reliable source is in the health sector and close to the management of the hotel. The Ministry of Health says it's found no evidence to back up what could be an urban myth. The Police Minister says a crackdown on organised criminal groups in Bay of Plenty is paying off. Leaders of the Mongols gang were arrested in raids on properties in Papamoa and Tupuki today. Stuart Nash says it's a great result.
These are violent offenders who brought back from Australia, set up this terrible gang. We're talking about drugs, we're talking about violence, we're talking about extortion, we're talking about fraud. Everything that is bad, these guys were into, and we've taken them down.
10 gang members face more than 200 charges, including money laundering and firearms offences. The outcry against controversial monuments has taken a new turn. A statue of former American President Theodore Roosevelt in New York is to be removed. Sarah Walton reports.
The statue of Theodore Roosevelt outside the Natural History Museum has long attracted controversy for its depiction of the former president on a horse, flanked below by a near-naked African-American man and a Native American man in traditional dress. The museum itself has asked for the Roosevelt statue to be removed, backed by his family, who says it doesn't truly reflect the president's legacy. No plans have been set for when it will be moved, but President Trump has reacted on Twitter, calling the decision ridiculous. I'm Sarah Walton in New York.
It's 5:04. On to sport now. The Warriors are grappling to come to terms with their new environment following the sudden departure of Stephen Kearney. The sacked coach has been replaced in the interim by assistant coach Todd Payton, who will be at the helm for the first time come Friday night when the Warriors play the Melbourne Storm. Centre Jared Beale says while there are mixed emotions about Kearney's departure, the players need to back Payton.
Everyone was quite emotional and probably their heads were all over the place. Some were probably angry, some were confused, some were just unsure. But, we have each other here. We're in this together. And the way out is, to work hard.
Jared Beale. The Chiefs and All Blacks loose forward Luke Jacobson will miss the rest of the Super Rugby Aotearoa competition after fracturing his hand in the side's loss to the Blues at the weekend. And Australian netball is to introduce a 2-point goal in its domestic competition. The super shot will give shooters the chance in the final 5 minutes of each quarter to score 2 goals by shooting from a 1.9 metre designated zone within the goal circle. There will also be rolling subs. That's the news.
As COVID cases surge around the world.
The war of COVID is still raging around the country. COVID is only a plane flight away.
Should travellers pay to keep the virus out?
I have no idea how I would pay that. If I have to pay that up front, I can't come home.
But nothing will stop this great migration.
There's a spear fisherman in murky water and he was buzzed by a humpback whale. So it looked quite scary because there was a big bolt coming out of the gloom and swimming along his length.
Clear thinking. Morning Report weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Now the short forecast taking us through to midnight tomorrow Wednesday. For Northland, scattered showers today. Periods of rain tomorrow, heavy from afternoon, possibly thundery. Auckland, a few showers, mainly north of the city. Rain setting in everywhere from tomorrow afternoon. Coromandel Peninsula, isolated showers today. Occasional rain tomorrow. Bay of Plenty, mainly fine. Isolated showers west of Te Puke, becoming cloudy tomorrow afternoon. Waikato to Kapiti Coast, including central high country. Fine apart from areas of morning cloud or fog. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, cloudy periods and isolated showers. Wellington and Wairarapa, mainly fine, areas of morning fog and isolated showers tomorrow evening. Inland Marlborough and Nelson, Buller, Westland and Fiordland fine. Coastal Marlborough and Canterbury Plains, that's from Ashburton northwards, mostly cloudy, patchy drizzle. South Canterbury, Otago and Southland, fine apart from low cloud or fog in some inland valleys. Cloud and patchy drizzle spreading northwards tomorrow. Cloudy periods at the Chatham Islands. It's nearly 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Paul, and welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Coming up on the program, 4-hour queues for COVID tests, and it could be 2021 before we see the much-anticipated Trans-Tasman bubble. Australia's Tourism Minister believes next year is realistic as the state of Victoria sees more cases of community transmission. In the past few minutes, the Health Minister, David Clark, has increased stricter testing at the border. Airport border staff and aircrew on high-risk routes like the United States will now be required to go into self-isolation and test negative for COVID-19 before they can fly again. This will come into effect immediately. He says conversations are ongoing with other airlines. And we'll have more on this throughout the program. But we begin tonight with a 7-year-old disabled boy at risk because he's being forced to live in a cold garage due to a lack of appropriate housing, according to a South Auckland social worker. Mum Maria and her 2 children have been camped out in a relative's garage for 6 months, including all through lockdown, sleeping 3 to a double bed. There are 4 generations in the granny flat. 7-year-old Jeremiah, who has cerebral palsy, relies heavily on a wheelchair, and his 8-year-old sister has epilepsy. In January, Maria brought her family home to New Zealand from Australia to escape a violent relationship. She's on the housing waiting list, but Maria says so far work and income has directed her to several unsuitable properties, including motel units with stairs and no disabled access. I went with cameraman Nick Munro to meet the family. In this quiet street, metal garage doors are a dime a dozen. But roll this one up and instead of a car, you'll find a family of 3 parked up because there's nowhere suitable for them to go. Hello, Jeremiah. How are you?
Good.
It's nice to meet you. Thank you for having us. 7-year-old Jeremiah lives here with his mum and sister. He's got a megawatt smile, a keen curiosity.
Oh, careful, the walls. You got to be careful. You got to be careful. Yeah, I know. You got to be really careful because you might scrape the walls. Okay, right?
And is a whiz in his electric wheelchair. But Jeremiah has cerebral palsy and is entirely reliant on Mum Maria for all the essentials.
Do you want your biscuit and milk, Jeremiah? Yeah? Okay.
He needs full assistance from me, so I do everything for him. He can't actually walk to the toilet or anything. I have to actually take him out of his wheelchair and put him onto his commode to take him to the toilets and things like that. I have to feed him. He can only pick like just little bits and pieces, bites of food.
Charlie D'Amelio, I know her.
Like a lot of kids his age, Jeremiah loves video games. It's something he can do without much help, and it keeps his hands and fingers nimble. And he's keen as to show us his room.
You coming?
I am. My name's Jeremiah, and this is my room. I sleep in the middle. Just back up. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
But let's be clearer still. This is not a room. It's a garage. The giveaway is the roller door a few metres from the bed. The family's possessions are boxed in tidy stacks around the perimeter. Clothes hang neatly on the overhead tracks that the garage door would roll up on if opened. There's not a lot of wiggle room here, especially for someone in a wheelchair.
Back. Back out.
The garage is also the laundry, so there's a sink and a washing machine a few metres away from the bed. Just one bed. Over there, what are we looking at? The back of the roller door, is it?
Yeah, that's the back of the roller door.
And in front of us, we've got... Is this a
double bed?
Double bed.
Yep.
Now, who sleeps in this bed?
Me, Jeremiah and Alaria, my 2 kids. We are
all of you in the same bed?
Yeah, all 3 of us in the same bed. We actually, heads there, legs out here.
Okay, so this bed is lying sideways, not the normal way.
Yeah.
And for all of you to fit in, you have to turn the bed sideways, and that would mean your legs hang off the edge of the bed, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
There's a tower of blankets on the bed. It's getting cold in the garage. 8-year-old Ilaria, who has epilepsy, is busy drawing a series of rainbows. She's tucked up on the top of the bed she shares with her mum and brother. Nights can be a little unsettled.
It's pretty much hard because I have to always get up late at night just to turn my son because he can't roll over on his own. So every night, it's like 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock at night, I'm up. I have to toss him onto the other side. He weighs over 30 kilos now.
The garage is attached to a perfectly nice granny flat, home to Jeremiah's great Nana, who turns 96 this year. She also relies on a wheelchair and her carers, Jeremiah's grandma and granddad. It's a Housing New Zealand property and the family's worried they're breaking the rules of their tenancy, with the rest of the whānau in the garage. There's not enough room here for the gear Maria ideally needs to care for her son, including a hoist. She does all the heavy lifting, including manoeuvring Jeremiah from the bed to his chair.
Ready?
1, 2, 3.
That's so much work. I'm sweating already. It's the lifting.
Changing her son's nappy is a workout. Then there's the nighttime lifting.
I can't really sleep at night. It's because I have to make sure whether they are warm enough, especially in the garage. You know, I don't want him to get sick. Because once he gets sick, it's a more worry, more stressful to me.
How much time do you spend worrying? If you're honest, really honest.
I worry all the time when it comes to my son. I try and do the best I can for him, but I can't really do much at the moment because we don't have that much space that we need to have for him to have a proper sleep and things like that.
What's your biggest fear?
My biggest fear is for him getting sick, having a seizure while we're asleep or something like that.
Maria's fears are grounded in her stark reality. About 6 weeks into their stay in the garage, Jeremiah was rushed to hospital by ambulance after suffering a prolonged seizure. According to his Middlemore Hospital medical notes, it lasted about 20 minutes on and off and was followed by vomiting. Maria had just left the garage to get his breakfast. When she came back, Jeremiah's arms and head were jerking, his teeth clenched and mouth frothing. Utterly terrifying for Maria. Diagnosis: a seizure and a viral illness.
Cancer drags me down. It pulls me down, but I can't think of that way to not do much. I have to just do what I can for my kids, especially for him. I know it's hard, but I don't know. I just...
Trying to stay positive.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go outside.
Maria says she went to work in income for housing help in February with details of Jeremiah's disability and health problems. And she says she made it clear where they were living. So they knew you were in a garage?
Yep, they know that I'm in a garage. When they first did my assessment, they knew that I was in the garage.
Maria was shown properties in February, including motels, but none of them had disability access. Work and Income says it's apologised for that. Even here, the families had to improvise with a very makeshift ramp knocked together from some leftover wood, so Jeremiah can get in and out of the house under his own steam.
Come through. Come through this way. Come.
Maria and her 2 children spent lockdown in the garage. MSD has provided Checkpoint with a statement. It says during lockdown, its ability to support Maria with her housing needs was limited. But it says it was in phone contact with the family. Maria says they called just once during that time. Now, MSD says Maria is on a waiting list for a 4-bedroom modified house in Manukau. But it goes on to say affordable accommodation is tight across the country, including Auckland, and it can't say exactly when a house that meets the family's needs will be available. Mangere social worker Alistair Russell has been working with the family.
Simply unacceptable. It's not okay. It's not okay in this country for any family to be living in this situation. We have the resources, we just simply lack the will to actually turn those resources into housing that people can actually live in, and housing that is suitable for a diverse range of need.
So what's your message to the agencies who are dealing with this family?
Get your act together, front up, actually address this family's needs, stop pretending that they're just one of the 20,000 on a waiting list, and actually be kind to this family and get them into a house that will protect this boy's health.
MSD says it's working on what support it can give Maria while she waits for a suitable house. It's also referred her to the Ministry of Health. For Maria, coming up 6 months in this garage, she has simply had enough of being parked out of sight.
It's really hard. I struggle. I struggle a lot, but there's nothing I can do. Nothing anyone can do. I have to do it. It's my son. And I'll do anything for my son.
What's the worst thing that could happen here?
Without being over dramatic, this house is potentially lethal over the winter months.
The day Checkpoint approached MSD about Maria's case, it reviewed her priority rating for housing, raising her up 4 grades from A12 to A16. The highest rating is A20. In a statement, the ministry said it reassessed Maria's priority rating to more accurately reflect the challenges of securing housing with wheelchair access. This had not been fully considered in the initial assessment, it says. It did not specifically respond to our request for an interview. The minister responsible for social housing is Chris Farfoy, and he will be joining us from our parliamentary studio in just under an hour from now. The rules for managed isolation and quarantine may be tightened even further as the government works to restore public confidence in the border regime. Ministers and officials are still dealing with the fallout from the 2 women allowed to leave managed isolation early under a compassionate exemption without being tested. In the past half hour, Health Minister David Clark has announced that from today, border staff and aircrew on high-risk routes like the United States will now be required to self-isolate and test negative for COVID-19 before they can fly again. He says conversations are ongoing with other airlines. But questions remain over how many people of the more than 2,000 who've left isolation facilities were tested before their departure, including 55 who left early on compassionate grounds. And today, 2 new cases from men arriving from India and from the United States brings New Zealand's active tally to 10. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
This past week, ministers and officials have been scrambling to make sure any flaws in the border regime are found and fixed. Testing remains an area of pressure, with continued questions over whether mandated testing for people leaving managed isolation has been carried out as it should have been. In Australia, isolation rules are a lot stricter, with people confined to their rooms with very limited time outside. The Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says the government is considering keeping people in their rooms until the day 3 test.
for example, at least for that first period until people have returned that initial test as negative. But we're looking at all these things. We're really, really focused on making sure it's working as it should.
When New Zealand moved into level 1, border controls were tightened. Tests at day 3 and day 12 were to be mandatory and a negative test would be required before leaving. A week later, the government suspended compassionate leave in response to the case of the 2 women who tested positive after leaving managed isolation early. But there was at least a week where testing was supposed to happen, but as demonstrated by their case, not every time. Dr Bloomfield says about 2,100 people are being tracked down and tested as a precaution who left managed isolation after the new testing rules were imposed up until the date the 2 women tested positive. A week on, and he still cannot say how many of the 55 who left on compassionate grounds or how many of that broader group left without being tested.
I will get you that number, and I'm sorry I haven't got it. I would like to have it as well.
He says health officials are still data matching and tracking people down and are treating it with urgency.
There's no obstruction. I can be really clear about that. I just want to be able to give you the right numbers.
Nationals leader Todd Muller is not impressed.
The fact that even today we are at a position that neither the Prime Minister nor David Clark nor Megan Woods can look at anyone in New Zealand and say exactly how many people left quarantine or left managed isolation without being tested is a national disgrace.
Does he believe there's been an active effort to hide the numbers, or is it incompetence?
It nearly always is the cock-up end of the equation. But that doesn't somehow mean that people can say, oh, well, that was just a cock-up. Because bluntly, we're talking about New Zealand's livelihoods, jobs, and confidence in the border here.
For the 5 weeks between May the 10th and June the 16th, when the 2 women tested positive, there were no cases of COVID reported at the border. Since then, there have been a handful of cases among people arriving back in New Zealand. Mr Muller says that raises more questions about the level of testing over those 5 or so weeks.
So you have 37, 38 days of apparently nothing arriving at the border, and then an admission that their testing procedures are failing, and now suddenly we've got this huge surge of them arriving at the border.
During question time, the minister responsible for isolation facilities, Megan Woods, said no conclusions should be drawn from the period of no cases from overseas.
Surveillance testing would suggest that it is entirely plausible that we didn't have cases. What the member needs to realise is the changing demographic inside our managed isolation and quarantine facilities.
But clarity today from Dr Bloomfield on reports by National MP Michael Woodhouse. A homeless man joined a managed isolation queue and spent 14 days in a hotel on the taxpayer.
As far as we can tell, this cannot be verified and may well be an urban myth.
However, Mr Woodhouse says he stands by his comments.
I was careful to say that they were unverified, but the source was reliable and that it warranted investigation. The absence of any evidence doesn't mean it did not occur, and indeed the Ministry have got a bit of a track record of missing things.
The government has also confirmed today COVID testing for aircrew, customs staff and other border workers is to be increased as part of a new surveillance testing plan. The priority will be testing at the border, with people working there regularly tested even if they have no symptoms. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
It's 24 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Tourism operators fear any further delays to Trans-Tasman and Pacific bubbles could be the nail in the coffin for the industry. With 10 active cases and quarantine bot traps, it could be months yet before Australian and Pacific visitors are allowed in. Meanwhile, Australian Tourism Minister Simon Birmingham has warned its borders will most likely be locked down until 2021. Eva Corlett reports.
The weekdays are the hardest for Skyline, an adventure tourism business in Queenstown and Rotorua. Locals are visiting in the weekends and school holidays, but in between, the luges and gondolas are quiet. Its chief executive, Jeff McDonald, says 80% of the Queenstown site's visitors are from overseas.
With a population of 5 million, with all the support they can offer us, people will get out and they'll travel and they'll visit and they'll support the tourism industry. But with 5 million people, there's only so many times they'll go out and do things. So as the timeline stretches out to getting an effective international travel bubble, it becomes more of a challenge.
Mr McDonald says the wage subsidy has been effective and he's waiting to see how the $400 million tourism fund will go. But the most important question remains.
Will our government and other governments around the world be prepared to just say, we're at a point where we're not going to completely eliminate COVID, but we can get it to a level that's sort of manageable, and that will allow us to reintroduce international travel. It's a big, tough call.
Motel Group Assure is just getting by with a few people staying in its units across the country. But with 45% of customers coming from overseas, its managing director Doug Robinson wants that border to reopen.
You can keep throwing money at these things, but that's not the answer. You've got to have some tangible way of getting business back up and going again. And I don't see that's going to happen in the near future anyway.
Trent Yeo runs Zip Trek Eco Tours in Queenstown. And while he's taken a hit from the closed borders, he's learned to adapt, including hiring out his grounds for a music event. He says anyone who relies solely on an overseas market in a post-COVID world is kidding themselves.
I think we have to make sure that we're pivoting towards our regions, our localities, and our nation for travellers. We have to be able to create something which is interesting and creates high value for a very different market.
Last week, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs, Winston Peters, floated the idea of New Zealand opening up bubbles with individual Australian states. But with a surge of new COVID-19 cases in Victoria, states are clamping down on their efforts to keep the virus out. The ABC's Casey Briggs says state premiers are watching what's happening in Victoria very closely.
Several states have now said we will wait and see, but we are open to keeping our borders closed to Victoria for even longer. Even New South Wales is now saying don't go to Melbourne unless you have to. The borders question is a fraught one politically in Australia at the moment.
And what about the Pacific? Well, after initial interest in a bubble, both the Cook Islands and Samoa have lost some enthusiasm in the wake of new COVID-19 cases here. Fiji has suggested a Bulla bubble with New Zealand, but with mandatory 2-week quarantine on both sides of the trip, it's hard to see how it will be attractive to travellers. The leader for the National Party, Todd Muller, says the criteria for opening up the borders should be made public to tourism operators and to Pacific nations like Fiji.
They have, as you know, been without a COVID case for many, many weeks now. They are, I'm sure, putting huge pressure on Australia and New Zealand to be innovative in terms of the way holiday travel, in particular, could be opened up to that market. That should be considered.
The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, says the government is talking with Pacific nations.
Fiji are in a position where they have seen lower numbers than many others. They haven't been entirely COVID-free though. We've set up our own criteria for what we would expect in the event of opening up bubbles. It's fair to say that at the moment, of course, the border remains the biggest vulnerability, so the area where we will be the most cautious. So I've nothing further to say on any bubble proposals at the moment.
Ms Ardern says there could be huge health costs if bubbles are opened up too early without proper processes in place. She says the government is looking at measures to make sure it's ready for that step. Mō te hōtaka o te ahia hinei, ko iwa ko le te tēnei.
Winter coughs and colds, along with fears around recent COVID cases, have combined to create massive queues at community testing stations. People are having to wait up to 4 hours to get a swab these days, with some giving up on the wait despite having COVID symptoms. Our cameraman Simon Rogers and reporter Nita Blake-Person visited an Auckland testing station to check out the delays.
Cars snake out of the medical centre car park and right down the road at this Panmure testing station. Drivers, some sick and some escorting crook families, are bracing for the necessary nasal swab.
It's probably just a cold, but we just thought, should get checked out. There's a bit of uncertainty now about what's out there.
Because I started feeling sick, and I told my boss and he told me to come get a test.
I just feel like I've got a normal cold. But they said that I needed to come and get tested, so I've come and got tested, been waiting to be tested.
I've got some mild cold symptoms and I thought it was the best thing to come. Checked in with the GP and they said that was what we should be doing.
The usual winter ills are arriving at the same time COVID cases have cropped up again in New Zealand, and that's creating a lot of unease.
I think people are getting worried. Yeah, they're getting worried. I mean, I guess the main thing to remember is the new cases are all from the quarantine hotels, not in the community. But I think because we had an increase in numbers, it's just making people worried.
Pauline Fuimaono Sanders is the operations lead at the Panmure Langemalie Clinic. They've been running since March 28th, but yesterday was their busiest day yet.
We did 191 tests yesterday, but across Auckland, we had 200s, 300s, 400s at the different testing centres. Well, when we went to level 1, the numbers dropped right off, and we had like 30, 40 in a day, and now we're doing over 150. And that's just us, and the other testing centres are doing more. It's been huge.
2 weeks ago, people were waiting between 15 and 30 minutes to get a test, but that's skyrocketed over the past week.
Yeah, wait times are varying between 2 to 4 hours, it's very sunny weather too, so we're quite conscious that people are waiting a long time and needing water, just the basics while they're waiting to get tested.
There were about a dozen staff on site here today and 6 in 2 mobile testing teams visiting quarantine hotels. With resources stretched, people are being told to be patient.
What's the time now? 12:51, so over an hour and a half.
About 2.5 hours. Yeah, I didn't quite understand how long it would take.
And I've been here for about an hour and a quarter.
About an hour and a half.
And most are prepared for the wait.
When I spoke to my GP, they said it would be about 2 hours. So I came prepared with food and magazines.
Is the wait deterring you? It is, but we've waited this long, so we'll just stick with it now. Yeah.
Well, I did bring a book, which was a very good thing, and I've been reading, waiting in the queue.
3 hours now.
Longer than you expected?
Yeah, way longer.
But some don't have time or patience to spare.
In the hour and a half I've been here, I've seen about probably 15 cars leave. So I actually was wondering how long before someone would come and start asking questions about wait times. If they want everyone to be tested, then they probably need better access.
Director General of Health Dr Ashley Bloomfield today reiterated there was no community transmission of COVID.
We've seen an increase in people presenting for testing, partly because we are going into winter, so more people have respiratory symptoms, but also I think the awareness over the last week. Then we will be doing the testing of everybody twice in managed isolation facilities, and we are seeing the number of people in those facilities grow. And we will be doing surveillance testing of people working in those facilities and at the border. So there will be thousands of tests being done every day, and we can do up to 12,000 or just over 12,000 if necessary.
And he backed the current testing setup. Yesterday, there were 4,303 tests completed at laboratories around the country. Today, the Minister of Health, David Clark, announced a new COVID testing strategy, ramping up checks at the border. He's also confirmed anyone presenting to primary or secondary care with COVID symptoms will be offered testing, even if they have no history of international travel or contact with travellers. And he says the Ministry of Health will rigorously monitor testing rates and conduct a weekly review of testing by each DHB and by ethnic group. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Nita Blake Person, aho.
And coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, Associate Housing Minister Chris Farfoy on the plight of a 7-year-old disabled boy living in a garage. The future of Ehumātao is once again in the spotlight, and the police say they've disestablished the senior hierarchy of a gang. An overseas gang as 10 patched members appear in court on 200 charges. We'd love your feedback as always on the 7-year-old boy, Jeremiah, who's been living in the garage since January. We'd also love to hear from you if you're in quarantine or managed isolation, or when you think a trans-Tasman bubble might be realistic. You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or there's always email. Our address is checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time now, though, to get to the headlines with Paul.
And yes, we're reading them off the script this time, Lisa, with a broken pair of glasses. How about that for radio listeners? Border workers and aircrew are to be swabbed more for COVID-19, even if they don't have symptoms. The Health Minister, David Clark, announced a new testing plan this afternoon. He says border staff are now the priority for testing because the biggest coronavirus risk is from New Zealanders returning from global hotspots. The Director General of Health has defended the integrity of managed isolation facilities, saying they're not cocktail parties or wedding receptions. Ashley Bloomfield has confirmed his ministry is still following up 2,159 people who left managed isolation between June the 9th and 16th. He says he can't say how many left without being tested, but he's adamant they posed a very low risk to the community. Another 2 cases of COVID-19 have been reported today, both men in their 20s returning from India and the United States. That brings the current total of active cases to 10. A Hastings-based Samoan chief convicted of human trafficking and dealing in slaves will forfeit nearly half his family's property to the Crown. In March, 65-year-old Joseph Matamata was found guilty of arranging to bring 13 Samoans to New Zealand between 1994 and April last year. An agreement has now been reached with him and his family under which his share of 2 properties will be forfeited. 10 members of the Mongols gang, including senior leaders, have been arrested in police raids in Bay of Plenty. They face a total of 228 charges, including participating in an organised crime group, money laundering, possession of firearms and explosives, and a raft of drugs charges. And about 20 people have protested at Littleton Port this afternoon against the arrival of a ship carrying a controversial fertiliser product they call blood phosphate. The product comes from Western Sahara, which Morocco is accused of illegally occupying. The importer, Ravensdown, says it's done due diligence with the supplier to operate within United Nations expectations. Those are the headlines.
Thanks, Paul. We got there in the end. We should explain that Paul operates the auto cue with a foot pedal like my grandma's old Singer sewing machine. We just had a bit of a mishap there. You're with Checkpoint, of course, and it's time for business with Nona Peltier. Nona, employment confidence, it's no surprise really that it's dropped, but to its lowest level in 16 years.
Yeah, it turns out that's its lowest level in history, since that's how long the survey has been going. So that it's pretty low. And it's not surprising, but what is that it's low across every measurement. So it's women, men, regions, big cities, you name it, in all sectors and across the board. Everyone is feeling down on their employment prospects, whether that's their wages, what they expect to be paid, what their job prospects are likely to be, and what the future is looking like for them. So it's really across the board. It's pretty dismal. However, people are a little bit more upbeat about the future. So perhaps the June quarter was what you'd expect with the lockdown, and that maybe things will look a little bit better. There are indications that the recession that had been forecast earlier won't be quite as severe and deep as earlier expected. So look, we're just going to have to watch that space. There's nothing particularly surprising about these numbers, except that it is really just across the board and quite
Whose
significant.
survey is it, Nona?
This is a Westpac.
And when do they do it again?
This is the June quarter, so they're going to be doing it for the September quarter, so you can expect to see the same kind of report, I guess, mid-September, just like mid to late September.
And do they think there's any kind of lag in the sense that obviously some people say the worst of the employment stats is still to come?
Well, the job ads show, reflecting some of the despair that people are feeling. I mean, they're making less money. More people are unemployed. We talked earlier about the number of people employed. What was it? It was like 1,000 people a day were losing their jobs. That's a lot of people. So you'd expect this survey to reflect what we know is out there. And of course, unemployment, the labor market, we're going to see a lot more of what's going on as time passes. And it's expected to accelerate when that wage subsidy comes off as well. So when we get to September, things could, get worse. So we'll just have to wait and see. Maybe it won't be as bad. Let's just hope, fingers crossed, that actually that segues very nicely into what I have to say about this company that we reported today.
So it's a property, Stride Property.
Yes.
Who are they?
Well, that's a diversified property company. So they have retail. They own like shopping malls. They own. They have a couple of different sort of funds. They have what's called Investor. We've talked about it before. It's the big box retail and standalone shopping, grocery stores and so on, as well as industrial products. And they're looking to invest in offices. Now, their profit fell for the year ended in March, but that was primarily because the value gains in their portfolio dropped, which we've seen across the board. Not surprising. But they said in an interview I did later with the chief executive that they're noticing that what they call the footfall traffic through their super shopping malls has increased from where it was, obviously, but to the point where it's about even where it was the year earlier. So they're thinking that the people have returned to the shops. They are spending money. So this is a positive for the retail sector, which had been struggling quite a lot. So this company's result was pretty good. They are in a good position with their balance sheet. They're looking for more opportunities. It was a pretty upbeat result overall. So their profit was $25.3 million, which was down 2/3 on the year earlier. But again, that was mostly because of some one-time items and the value in their portfolio. So there you go.
And what about the market? What numbers do you bring us
just
today?
Picking up on Stride, their share price rose 3%, which is pretty good considering overall our market was down 0.25%, 26 points down to 11,132. Now, the region had a real choppy session because there was a lot of confusion over whether or not the China-US trade deal was on or off. There was a lot of confusion. When the clarification came, it seemed to make the market feel a little bit more secure. So we'll see what happens overnight. But anyways, our dollar is trading at 64.7 US cents, 93.6 cents Australian, and 51.9 British pence.
Thanks, Nona. Nona Peltier with our business news. The police say they've disestablished the senior hierarchy of the Mongols gang in New Zealand after raiding properties in the Bay of Plenty today. 10 patched members are now before the court, facing more than 200 charges, including participating in an organised criminal group, money laundering and firearms offences. The development comes after escalating violence in the Bay of Plenty region as gangs, both new and old, fight over drug territories. Annika Smith filed this report.
AK-47s, motorcycles, Molotov cocktails, methamphetamine, cash and even a homemade bomb. These are just a few of the items seized during police raids at 10 properties in Bay of Plenty this morning. The search warrants brought to an end Operation Silk, an organised crime group investigation tracking the Mongols motorcycle gang, who've sought to establish a foothold in the region over the past year. Detective Superintendent Greg Williams of the National Organised Crime Group says the chapter originated in an entirely different gang and country.
This particular chapter, or the majority of this chapter, were actually members of one Bandidos motorcycle chapter based in Brisbane that were deported back to New Zealand about a year ago. When they arrived here, they formed a Bandidos chapter, but eventually have patched over to the Mongols. So they were the first Mongols group based here in New Zealand.
First established in the United States, the Mongols motorcycle gang are an international organised crime group, well known for drug dealing, violence and firearms offences. There have been 6 shootings linked to the gang since they established a foothold in Bay of Plenty just 1 year ago. Mr. Williams says the gang has been at the centre of escalating violence in the region as gangs fight over limited drug territory.
They're all fighting for a share of the market down there, and I think the point of this group arriving down there has caused massive trauma within that gang network because there is actually only a captured market of people they can sell to. So, I think we've seen through various other operations a lot of those communities down there sadly being impacted by meth.
Mr. Williams says the arrests show gang activity will not be tolerated. It's a sentiment echoed by the Police Minister, Stuart Nash, who says the arrests will have a significant impact on the methamphetamine trade and into gang violence in the region.
My understanding is when the Mongols arrived, that's when things started to go really bad. These are violent offenders who brought back from Australia, set up this terrible gang. We're talking about drugs, we're talking about violence, we're talking about extortion, we're talking about fraud, everything that is bad these guys were into, and we've taken them down.
Te Puke Community Board Chairperson Richard Crawford, who's also a firefighter, says locals have been aware of escalating gang tensions since last year.
There was a pretty high level of stuff going on earlier this year. Papamaa, Te Puke, out in the rural areas where some of these guys hang out. There were some retaliations and shootings and all sorts of stuff were going on.
The Community Board pushed to have CCTV and licence plate recognition cameras installed in the town, which Mr Crawford says are having a big impact on crime.
So now when any criminal comes in with stolen cars or false number plates, they pick up and they're able to alert the police straight away, and the people who are coming out of town obviously commit a crime, they're being able to get onto them before the crime's committed. And we see activity in our parks in the middle of the night, dangerous stuff. that we're picking up on and able to get the police involved really early because we've seen it on the cameras.
Today's raids follow Operation Nest Egg that targeted a Mongols chapter in Auckland. It terminated with the arrests of 5 people and the seizure of firearms, methamphetamine and $400,000 in cash in May. Detective Superintendent Greg Williams says both operations will have a serious impact on the influence of the Mongols gang in New Zealand. The police are still seeking Australian national Brodie Collins Haskins, a senior Mongols member who has a warrant for his arrest in Auckland. They say he is dangerous and should not be approached. For Checkpoint, this is Annika Smith.
The leaders of the Ihumātao occupation say they are unlikely to accept a government deal that results in houses being built on the whenua. It comes amid speculation the government will use the Housing Act to acquire the land. Miriana Johnson reports.
It's understood that a governance group made up of both central, local government and mana whenua representatives will also be established to make any decisions on the land. But Minister for Finance Grant Robertson is still tight-lipped on what a prospective deal will look like.
The way we've made progress is on the basis of trust and confidentiality. There have been a number of different moving parts here and we're continuing to make progress, but I'm not going to confirm anything until we finalise it.
Soul co-founder Kiani Matatasipu says they will be given final say on any deal and they haven't signed off on anything yet. She is clear though that her whānau don't want a deal which includes houses on the whenua.
The government saying we want this number of houses, it hasn't been something that we've had to consider yet. But our whānau has been very strong in the feeling that we don't want any new houses on that whenua. And so it's very likely that if the number of houses were prescribed, that we would say no.
Victoria University Associate Professor of Law, Carwyn Jones, says if the government were to use the Housing Act, it would be just another elegant solution to evading a treaty issue. He says it does help to avoid the flaws and constraints of a treaty settlement process.
But it does mean that some issues are perhaps not going to be directly addressed, and I think the key thing is, does it provide a mechanism which those who exercise mana whenua there feel that they'll have a resolution that they can work with.
The National Party has firmly opposed the government purchasing land at Ihumātao as they argue local iwi have already received their settlement and this would undo the process. Former leader of the National Party, Simon Bridges, says using the Housing Act to acquire the land still opens a can of worms.
I think you're setting a very dangerous precedent here that ultimately reopens the issue in relation to private land and also a full and final treaty settlement. So I can't be any clearer than this is plain wrong.
The Minister of Treaty Negotiations, Andrew Little, refutes this.
In terms of where things are at, the last time I had a briefing, I'm satisfied that that principle of full and final settlement is not compromised.
But Carwyn Jones says the government shouldn't be afraid of setting a precedent.
If this was a precedent of expecting government to make good on its treaty obligations outside of historical settlements, or to normalise engagement with mana whenua, or for Māori to play a decision-making role in relation to our traditional lands, then that would seem to me to be a good precedent to be setting.
In the meantime, Kiani Matatasipu says her whānau are excited that their 5-year battle to protect the land at Ihumātao is nearing an end. Mo te hōtaka o te aiahi, ko Miriana Johnson tēnei.
It is 12 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keen for your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Positive news arrived with bagged lunch today at one of Auckland's isolation hotels. A note tucked in with the meal telling guests someone among them is confirmed to have COVID-19 and the hotel is now in lockdown. It's one of 2 new cases announced today, one in arrival from India and the other from Los Angeles. Both men are in their 20s and are now at the Jet Park Hotel. Boaz Fetchy returned home from New Zealand from LA 12 days ago and has been isolated at Auckland's Pullman Hotel, where one of the new cases was discovered.
Yeah, people are going down to the lobby and having ciggies and stuff, and I can hear people just leaving from the rooms across from me. They're going out, and I can hear them be like, "I'll be back later," and whatnot. And I'm like, "Where are you going? Where are these people going?" I have stayed in my room this whole time. I got my test done today, and that was the first time leaving my room.
How long have you been there for?
This is my 12th day.
Is that your first test?
Yep, it is.
So nobody tested you on day 3 or offered you a test on day 3?
They did actually offer me a test on day 3, and I was like, I'm not going to leave my room right now. I'm going to get it on the day closer to when I leave. Because I knew I wasn't going to leave my room and put anyone at risk.
Tell me about the process for testing. Were people socially distant? Where did that happen? What was it like?
Yeah, so I'm on the 11th floor, and so we went up to the 12th floor, and I went up there expecting it to be just me, really. Like, I thought they would call people in one by one. So they would call us in, and they had these couch seats, and they'd be like, take a seat, and I was like, no, I'm good, I'll just stand, thanks. Like, I don't want to sit in the seat that everyone's sitting in. And they're like, oh, you can move on to the next seat. And I'm like, oh, I'll just stay standing. And then they call you through to the test, and they're also there. They're like, all right, take a seat. And I'm like, can I get my test just standing up? I don't want to touch anything in here. And then, I got my test standing up, and they shove a swab way up your nose and wiggle around, and pretty uncomfortable, but needs to happen.
So do you feel that there was a bit too much milling going around, too many people clustered in the same area waiting for their tests?
Yeah, I think they should try to space out the calling people up, because I could see, like, this lady come up with her baby, like, should we be up here yet? Like, there was, these two guys that saw each other, and he's like, oh, what's up, homie? And then they're, like, shaking hands and stuff. I mean, the doctors just look at them like, whoa, what you guys doing?
Do you know if these people are all from your same flight?
Yeah, I recognized a lot of them from my flight from LA, which is the scary part. We flew in from LA, where there's like a ton of cases over there.
So how compliant do you think people are being with the rules?
Not very, honestly. They're walking around in the lobby up here and stuff, and like, I don't know. Yeah, they've given us spaces to exercise and stuff like that, and there's nothing really stopping people from, well, they said we can go out to the lobby and go get some fresh air, but like that's also where other guests are coming in that are staying here that I think a lot of them are unaware that there's a bunch of quarantiners in here.
There is a mention in that notice that they've given to you about the smoking area. Can you tell us anything about that? Did you see it when you came in? Are people mixed in there together? It says it's restricting numbers, but obviously more than one person can be there at a time. What can you tell us?
So now it's saying the area has been restricted to 3 people max. So I don't know what it was before, and they're going to be keeping tabs on how much time you're allowed to spend in that area. I didn't see the area. I'm kind of assuming it's close to my room somehow, because I keep getting whiffs of cigarette smoke. I don't know where that's coming from though, but yeah, I haven't gone for an explore. I'm not really willing to walk around the place, especially now that we know there's someone with the virus in here.
Overall, how do you think your hotel's done?
They could be, honestly, like when I went up for the test, I was expecting someone to be there with a disinfectant bottle spraying down the elevator buttons. That's what scares me the most. It's like the elevators, people pressing the same buttons and whatnot. Someone should be there spraying the buttons, being like, you guys need to stay apart. There was one point where this guy came up next to me and he was all like snivelly nose and his eyes were all red. I'm like, whoa, is this guy sick? And the dude luckily spotted him and was like, hey, keep your distance, man. But apart from that, the Pullman's been really good. Like, they've looked after us amazingly, feed us 3 times a day. My room has a bath, like, views over Rangitoto. Like, it's, like, amazing. And if you can't put up with this for 14 days, then, like, how much do you care about your country, really, you know?
What was in the lunch bag, by the way, besides the note?
I got roast kumara and like other roast veggies. That I chose the vegetarian option. There's 3 options you can choose from, and I also got it was like a mud cake, like a chocolate mud cake, mandarins, some potato chips. Or actually, no, I got popcorn today. They've been keeping me filled with snacks and all sorts of goodies.
If you had to pay for isolation, would you? Would you have come home and paid?
Yeah. Yep, for sure. I said that to my family before I even knew that the government was going to be doing this. I said, I'm going to stay in a hotel, whether it be like up in Auckland, or I instantly get in a car and drive to, I wasn't going to put my family at risk, especially with people in my family with asthma and respiratory issues.
So what do you reckon isolation is worth? What's the fair price? 2 weeks.
Oh man, if you paid for what I'm receiving, this would be a lot. I don't know how much, probably 600 or something. Maybe I would say more than that for what I've received.
On average, Boaz, it works out at about $4,000 a person per isolation. So,
oh my gosh.
Yeah, what do you think would be fair? Paying how much of that? Half? A quarter?
A quarter, I think, would be, if they could, a quarter would be fair.
So $1,000, you'd pay that for your 2 weeks of isolation?
Yeah.
And that was Boaz Fetchy, who is in isolation at the Pullman Hotel. Some of you getting in contact about testing for COVID. This person says, 8-year-old son told he needed testing for a sore throat. First appointment I could get in Wellington was more than 24 hours later after spending an hour on the phone with 48 hours to wait for the results. So it looks like 4 days off school for this kid for what is probably a viral sore throat. Happy we could be tested and we're encouraged to. Can see why people will avoid it with the delay. Jane, however, says she went for a COVID swab at a testing station in St Luke's in Auckland on Sunday, waited less than 30 minutes and got the results via text the same day. And she's surprised to hear so many people are having to wait for such a long time. Thanks for getting in touch. The best hope to curb the spread of COVID-19 and prevent hundreds of thousands of deaths remains a vaccine. It's still uncertain whether one will be developed, but the ABC's Annie Guest looked at how the best candidates around the world are progressing.
Now, the race is on in laboratories right around the globe to find a vaccine.
Today, the first human trial in the Southern Hemisphere officially begins in Melbourne.
To find a COVID-19 vaccine.
There's a lot of noise about a potential vaccine. But in its absence, the World Health Organisation's most recent briefing highlighted one potential treatment.
The recent finding that the steroid dexamethasone has life-saving potential for critically ill COVID-19 patients gave us a much-needed reason to celebrate.
But as demand for dexamethasone soars worldwide, WHO's Director General, Dr Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, says there's a high risk of fraudulent drugs entering the market.
The next challenge is to increase production and rapidly and equitably distribute dexamethasone worldwide, focusing on where it's needed most.
However, with the steroid treatment only useful for the sickest patients and another drug authorised for COVID-19, remdesivir, shortening recovery but not boosting survival, the WHO is warning precautionary measures may be necessary for years. Here's Special Envoy Dr David Nabarro.
Please plan to have to live with this virus for the foreseeable future. It's 2.5 years, really, until there'll be vaccine available for everybody in the world.
But there is potential for vaccines to be available earlier than that in certain countries. University of New South Wales epidemiologist Professor Mary Louise McClaws spoke to RN Breakfast.
WHO is concerned that the rollout, the production will take time, but the rollout will take even longer. It needs to be in those areas where they find it very difficult to control. They have very limited capacity to undertake a public health response. And we see this in the Americas at the moment. In Brazil, it's out of control.
There are more than 100 possibilities or vaccine candidates being researched, with a handful reaching human trials. Here's Nobel Prize-winning immunologist Professor Peter Doherty.
I'm sort of fairly confident we will get a vaccine. We'll know later this year whether I think the Jenner Institute vaccine and at least one of the Chinese vaccines that are quite advanced are looking to be good. They've progressed those vaccines very fast, and I now believe they're going to deploy them in Brazil, which is highly infected with this virus, and they're having a terrible time of it.
The UK's Jenner Institute's human trials in Brazil are expected to be more conclusive than its initial phase 2 trials in Oxford, where there were less cases.
competition.
And that is Annie Guest with that report. Time for some feedback before the news at 6. On the family we reported on who have been living in a garage with one of them is a 7-year-old boy who has severe disabilities. Ray says Maria's story is heartbreaking. Meanwhile, the taxpayer is paying for returning New Zealanders to isolate in luxury accommodation. It's a disgraceful farce that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. Berry says what a dignified young gent Jeremiah is. Golly though, their plight for housing, that's got tears out of me. And someone else says even if they had an A20 rating, which is the top rating you can have on the housing waiting list, the family would be lucky to get a house. There is simply not enough affordable housing being built in New Zealand, that person says. Oh, and before we get to the news, here's one for Paul Brennan, who had a little mishap with his glasses and controlling the auto cue. Blair says, oh no, Lisa. All these crises going on and our RNZ newsreaders are peddling in broken reading glasses. Kia kaha, he loves your work.
RNZ News at 6. Good evening, I'm Paul Brennan. Flight crews on high-risk routes such as the United States will have to return a negative COVID-19 test before they can return to work or the community. Under a new government plan, all air crews and airport workers will be regularly tested, even if they have no coronavirus symptoms. So will staff who work in managed isolation facilities or quarantine, and the drivers who get new arrivals there from the airport. And unlike most New Zealanders, they won't need to have a cough, a runny nose, or other COVID-19 symptom. The Health Minister, David Clark, says he'll leave it to public health experts to decide when the regular tests happen. The New Zealand First Leader, Winston Peters, wants all returning New Zealanders to help cover the cost of their 14-day stay in isolation, saying they've had plenty of warning to come home. More than $80 million of government money has already been spent on paying for hotel accommodation, and another $300 million has been set aside for the rest of the year. Cabinet is considering charging people as a way of bringing the cost down, and Mr Peters says that's only fair.
Surely we can't keep loading the taxpayer up. Don't forget, on the 14th of March, I told you people as well, I told them to come home. Then. Not now, then.
The New Zealand First Leader, Winston Peters. The insurance underwriter, IAG, is proposing to shut all its 53 AMI stores and its remaining state insurance store and move the 350 staff involved to digital and contact centre roles. About 65 management positions could also be disestablished, although the company says it hopes to redeploy as many staff as possible. Spokesperson Kevin Hughes says the review reflects growing customer expectations for digital services, which have been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Staff are being advised this morning. A disabled 7-year-old boy has been forced to live in a cold garage for 6 months because of a lack of suitable housing. Jeremiah, who has cerebral palsy, has been camped out in a relative's garage with his mother and sister. His mother, Maria, told Checkpoint Work and Income has directed her to unsuitable properties, including motel units, with no disabled access.
He needs full assistance from me, so I do everything for him. He can't actually walk to the toilet or anything. I have to actually take him out of his wheelchair and put him onto his commode to take him to the toilets and things like that. I have to feed him.
That's Maria, who's living in a garage with her disabled son. A Hastings-based Samoan chief convicted of human trafficking and dealing in slaves will forfeit nearly half his family's property to the Crown. In March, 65-year-old Joseph Matamata was found guilty of arranging to bring 13 Samoans to New Zealand between 1994 and April last year. Anusha Bradley reports.
The Crown considered Matamata's Camberley property as tainted, arguing it was bought with the proceeds of crime. An agreement has now been reached with him and his family, under which his share of 2 properties will be forfeited. The value of his share is worth $215,000. Matamata will be sentenced next month, and the money could be used to pay reparation to his victims. Ko Anusha Bradley Aho.
Video has emerged of a delivery driver in Paris dying while being pinned down by the police despite pleading he couldn't breathe. 4 French police officers are now being investigated. The BBC's Warren Bull reports.
Cedric Chouviat was riding his scooter near the Eiffel Tower when he was stopped by police on January the 3rd. A phone recording of the incident shows Mr. Chouviat being pinned down by officers, and he can be heard 7 times saying he is suffocating before passing out. He had a heart attack and died 2 days later. A post-mortem showed his larynx had been broken. Prosecutors have opened a case for involuntary homicide. The investigation comes weeks after the French government reviewed restraint techniques used by its own police force,
Warren Bull with that report. It's 4 minutes past 6. Sport now. The English football club Burnley are ashamed and embarrassed that a banner reading White Lives Matter, Burnley, was towed by a plane over their stadium during a Premier League match against Manchester City. The aircraft circled the stadium just after kick-off in City's 5-0 win. Burnley manager Sean Dyche has condemned the action.
Didn't know what it was about until directly after the game. One of the players mentioned on his phone about it, said, "Gaffer, we've got to go out and say something." I said, absolutely. It's unacceptable. You don't want that attributed to the whole town and the people or to the club.
Moments earlier, Burnley and City players and staff had taken a knee in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. Bubba Wallace's fellow NASCAR drivers have pushed his car to the start line of a race in Alabama to show their support for him, a day after a noose was found in his team's garage. Wallace, the competition's sole full-time black driver and a vocal supporter of Black Lives Matter, was overcome with emotion by the show of solidarity. Former All Black hooker Mark Hammond is stepping down as assistant coach with the Highlanders at the end of the Super Rugby Aotearoa competition, but he says he hasn't decided what he'll do next. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Patrick Phelps digs up another mining story west of the Southern Alps, who've got a window on the world of 5G technology, while Trevor Reekie speaks to WOMAD 2020 sensations Flor Di Talawachi.
Your love was never more than an illusion I thought belonged to me.
That's Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
We are funded through New Zealand On Air. Here's the short forecast now from our Met Service through to midnight tomorrow, Wednesday. For Northland, scattered showers today, periods of rain tomorrow, heavy from afternoon, possibly thundery. Auckland, a few showers, mainly north of the city, rain setting in everywhere from tomorrow afternoon. Coromandel Peninsula, isolated showers today, occasional rain tomorrow. Bay of Plenty, mainly fine. Isolated showers west of Te Puke, becoming cloudy tomorrow afternoon. Waikato to Kapiti Coast, including central high country, fine apart from areas of morning cloud or fog. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, cloudy periods, isolated showers. Wellington and Wairarapa, mainly fine, areas of morning fog. Isolated showers tomorrow evening. Inland Marlborough, also Nelson, Buller, Westland and Fiordland, it'll be fine. Coastal Marlborough and Canterbury Plains from Ashburton northwards, mostly cloudy, patchy drizzle. South Canterbury, Otago and Southland, fine apart from low cloud or fog, and some inland valleys, cloud and patchy drizzle spreads north tomorrow. And for the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. It's coming up to 7 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Paul. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Returning now to our earlier story about a South Auckland family, including a severely disabled boy living in a garage because of a lack of suitable state housing. Mum Maria and her 2 children have been camped out in a relative's garage for 6 months. Her 7-year-old son has cerebral palsy and relies heavily on a wheelchair, and her daughter has epilepsy. They sleep 3 to a double bed, and there are 4 generations of whānau using the attached granny flat. The family's on the housing waiting list, but MSD has had to apologise to Maria after directing her to properties that are not wheelchair friendly. Since Checkpoint got involved, the family has been reassessed and their priority rating has gone up 4 spots. So how well is social housing catering for people with disabilities? The Associate Housing Minister, Chris Farfoy, has responsibility for public housing, and he joins us now from our parliamentary studio in Wellington. Good evening, Minister. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, Lisa.
Just to start off with, can we agree with what garages are for and what they are not for?
Well, obviously, I think we've got to make sure we have as many New Zealanders as we possibly can living in conditions that are good. And any parent who is dealing with 2 children who have either a disability or conditions in this case, we would prefer not in there, and that's why an apology has been made, which is the right thing to do. And MSD will be in touch with the family tomorrow to try and expedite the efforts to try and make sure that they can find an appropriate place for them to live.
Obviously, we've drawn this to your attention. What do you think of the situation they are in, and whether enough has been done for them so far?
Well, I would have liked to have them not to have been through the experiences of being offered 2 places that aren't suitable, and an apology has been made for that, as you've said. But again, I would say a mother in the situation that she's in, with two very young children with the conditions that they're in, shouldn't be living in a garage, and that's why MSD will be speaking to them tomorrow with the assistance of a housing navigator to make sure we can expedite the efforts to find them a suitable property.
So how many houses do we have in stock that are accessible?
So there are 65,000 kainga order properties, Lisa. I'm told that about 4,000 of those have been modified in some way, shape or form to make sure that the people living in them can do so because they might have disabilities. That can range from anything like widening the hallways in order to allow wheelchairs to move freely around the property, or a wet bathroom with rails and easily accessible. So there are 4,000 within that.
Okay.
And also a target has been set for the new homes that we are building as part of the public housing building program of 15% of homes that have universal design principles, which essentially mean that they'll be accessible for people with disabilities.
But modified housing is different from fully accessible housing. It could just be a handrail. That counts as modification.
So
do we know how many of that group are actually fully accessible?
No, I don't know that, but I know that...
Do they keep that information?
No, they don't, but they will be. They are going to start collecting that as of August. I don't know the answers behind that, but we have been asking questions about accessibility for some time. There are 65,000 properties, as I mentioned, Lisa, so it would take some time to get through them. But I understand as of August, new data will come through, so we'll have better understanding of what the accessibility issues are, or what types of accessibility we have for some of those properties around the country.
When you talk about a 15% target for the new construction, that's 15% of then, 2,000 houses? So only about 300 properties.
Yeah, that's of the building houses as of, I think it's 2021. So I think it's going to be more than that. But again, I realise there's huge demand for properties with accessibility features. I spoke to Dave Matthews from CCS about this about a couple of months ago, and we are acute to the issues around demand to make sure that we can do our best around the new houses that are being built and continuing to do what we've done for some time about making specific modifications for people who are on either the waiting list or being asked to be transferred to a different kainga order property because of accessibility issues.
And how many are there of those people who are on the list looking for a modified property or are transferred to a modified property?
So the March number that we had was 930 out of the just a little over 19,000 people who are either on the waiting list or on a list for transfer from one KO property to the other. I'll put a caveat on that. We think that's underreporting because there are instances that we know of, and I've seen this as a local MP as well, where someone might have an accessibility issue, but they don't necessarily flag that at the time when they apply or ask for a transfer because they think that might affect their chances of getting a property sooner. So there are many things that we can do, getting good information from those who apply, but also making sure that we're being vigilant and looking for every opportunity to supply a property that is either built to a design standard or if it's already existing, and we're talking more about properties that are on flat land and flat properties themselves, that we are helping to make sure we can make changes to those properties that suit the needs of the clients that are asking for an accessible property.
Are we letting our most vulnerable people down here? Because Maria's story isn't the first one like this, and you know this. We came to you about another one similar. So are these people being let down?
Look, I wouldn't say that. We are trying to make sure that, because I think there's also a way in which we are dealing with these people, and as I say, we're asking for more to be done to find a suitable property. It is a challenge making sure we can find a property for those with disabilities, and the waiting list is long. But I would hope when someone presents themselves as they have in this case, with yet two young children with pretty serious illnesses, we go above and beyond to make sure that they're in a suitable property.
Did it? That didn't happen because...
And Lisa, that's why there has been an apology and why I've come here tonight to say that we want more to be done to ensure that this family is looked after and the efforts are made to expedite making sure they can get into an appropriate property.
Understood.
And we'll be sending a message to the system as a whole that when a case like this is presented, we've got to do better.
Can we check back with you then after they have the conversation with the family to see if you've managed to resolve the situation?
I would hope that the people who are going to speak to them have got the message that we've got to do better, and that's why they'll get a call from MSD tomorrow, and a housing navigator will sit down with his family to expedite the efforts to get them into an appropriate property.
Appreciate your time this evening. That's the Associate Housing Minister, Chris Farfoy, who was joining us live from our parliamentary studio in Wellington. Flight crews on high-risk routes will have to return a negative COVID test before they can return to work or the community under a new government plan. And all air crews and airport workers will be regularly tested, even if they have no COVID symptoms, under a new government testing plan. The Minister of Health, David Clark, has released the plan this afternoon, and health correspondent Rowan Quinn has the details.
David Clark says the new rule for a negative test applies to flight crew returning from any high-risk country.
Those are areas in the United States currently that recognised as the high-risk route that in New Zealand, for example, is flying. So people flying where there is high COVID will be required to go into self-isolation upon return, complete a test that's negative before they return into the community.
David Clark says the greatest risk for New Zealanders are the thousands of people returning from global hotspots. Under the new testing plan, pilots, airport cleaners, customs officers and more will be regularly tested. So will staff who work in managed isolation facilities or quarantine, and the drivers who get new arrivals there from the airport. And unlike most New Zealanders, they won't need to have a cough, a runny nose or another COVID symptom. Dr Clark says he'll leave it to the public health experts to decide when that happens.
They will make the decision about how often that testing is appropriate, but we do want to make sure that those people there are not being exposed. We've got no evidence that they are, so that's the one thing, but we want to be sure.
Dr Clark also says there'll be renewed focus on testing in the community, although it wasn't immediately clear that differed from the current policy of testing anyone with a single symptom. Community testing centres in many parts of the country have been busy in the past 7 days after cases began to arrive again from overseas. The centres in some regions have already closed, but the Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says testing may need to scale up again.
What we're talking about with the district health boards today is making sure that we can maintain 24/7 testing capacity. We may need to surge up capacity, and yes, off the back of the cases in the last week, there has been, I think, a high level of awareness and people are going for testing.
He says most winters there's surveillance testing for flu with about 270 people swabbed each week.
We're now going to be doing thousands a day, which I would call, just really, really extensive sentinel testing in the community to make sure that if there is any virus out there, we are picking it up.
And David Clark says district health boards will be required to create a plan to make sure they're keeping up with national testing rates and testing all communities. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi ko Rowan Quinn DNA.
It is almost 17 minutes after 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The number of Southern Response claims is continuing to rise, dashing hopes most claims would be sorted by the middle of 2020. In January this year, Southern Response General Manager Casey Hurren told RNZ there were about 200 claims left. EQC took over those claims at the end of 2019 and former Deputy Chief Executive Renee Walker told RNZ she hoped there would be a few by mid-2020. That hasn't happened, with claims now totalling 236. The Minister responsible, Grant Robertson, is disappointed, but he and EQC say there are good reasons why. Our reporter Logan Church filed this report.
2020 started with optimism from Southern Response and EQC about the remainder of Southern Response's claims. There were, and I quote Southern Response here, about 200 left. EQC were taking them over, bringing in 12 Southern Response claims specialists on board. But 6 months later, when EQC originally said it hoped most claims would be settled or have managed repairs underway.
So I think we'll first of all acknowledge we're not where we would like to be, Logan. At the moment, open, we've got around 230 claims that we are handling on Southern Response's behalf.
236 to be exact. That's EQC's new head of Canterbury Claims, Kate Todd. The plight of those insured by Southern Response has been well documented by Checkpoint. Homeowners have told us of extended delays, standover tactics and immense pressure to settle for what homeowners believe is less than they are entitled to under their insurance policy. One of the 236 homeowners who asked not to be named had her ring foundation damaged in the September 2010 earthquake, almost 10 years ago. She is still fighting for some of the costs to getting her house repaired.
Completely and utterly frustrating. Like the hours and hours and hours and the endless amounts of money that you spend trying to defend and present your claim is just ridiculous. All the outside of the house is split. It's winter now, rock gets in. It's just crazy.
EQC's Kate Todd says there are several factors as to why the total number of claims is increasing.
We continue to get claims over cap. So, for example, this year we've received a 90 new claims over cap into the Southern Response bucket. And we also, I think we appreciate now looking at these claims, the layers of complexity of these claims that we're dealing with. The complexities are around, we've got differing reports. It's building the homeowners' trust about the process that we're going through.
She also says the COVID-19 lockdown caused extra delays.
We've lost over 2 months of site visits. Now, we were only able during COVID lockdown to do desktop tasks on these claims, and the reality is most of these claims need site visits to progress them.
And Ms Todd says new inquiries about Southern Response claims are coming in every day. She describes the original goal of having most sorted by mid-2020 as aspirational.
EQC is absolutely committed. We owe it to these homeowners who will be frustrated, probably some of them very angry that their claim has not been settled so far.
The minister responsible for EQC, Grant Robertson, said he had hoped EQC would have settled more Southern Response claims by now.
I would have hoped they could have been progressed a little quicker than this, but there are reasons for that. They've taken on a number of unsold cases which have ended up being added to that total, and obviously we've had the COVID situation as well. As we get more and further on into the Canterbury claim sequence, the cases get more complex as well, but I'm monitoring very closely how they're going.
Casey Hurren, General Manager for Southern Response, says he also hoped more claims would have been resolved by now. 95 claims have been resolved this year so far.
I'm not surprised. I would have hoped that the number that we've resolved would be higher than the number that we've got in. But I think, as I say, that's just a product of a push to have people that have had unsold properties or are looking to sell their homes in a position where they can check to see if the original work that was done in the first place has been done properly.
And Mr Hurren expects more claims to come in.
At this stage, I expect that we still will continue to receive new overcap claims for the reasons that I was just speaking about before. What would be the ideal outcome from Southern Response's perspective is that there is a net reduction in the overall overcap claim portfolio, so that as we get to the end of 2020, we can be in a position that we can reduce our operating staff both within Southern Response and also EQC.
Casey Hurren says anyone who is struggling with their claim or communicating with those handling their claim should get in touch.
I understand that there are people out there that may still be frustrated with how quickly their claim is progressing and would like to see more movement, and I would encourage them to speak to their claims handler that's looking after them in EQC and set out exactly what it is that they think would be needed to expedite their claim.
In total, Southern Response has paid out $3.14 billion and settled 48,864 claims. For Checkpoint, Logan Church.
And if you're one of those outstanding Southern Response customers, we would love to hear from you. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Some more of your feedback now. This is around the earlier interview we did with a person isolating at the Pullman Hotel, and obviously another guest has tested positive for COVID-19 at that hotel. This person says, how out of touch are these people if they think 2 weeks in a hotel with 3 meals a day can be had for $600? That's obviously around the issue of potential co-payments and the government needing to spread the cost. Another one says it is so sad to hear so many of the returning New Zealand citizens you talk to sounding entitled and demanding. People wipe buttons and chairs for themselves and treat them as they have to take responsibility for keeping themselves safe. Wearing gloves and using hand sanitizer isn't hard to do. We had to. We all took responsibility through lockdown. So sad they seem to think that we owe them. Another one says, my son's partner would be happy to be able to rejoin him in New Zealand if she could. She would love to have 2 weeks in isolation, even willing to pay for managed isolation herself. They had to park company at Sydney Airport. She couldn't come here and is in Argentina, hoping to join him here like the other 10,000 people hoping to get into New Zealand. The Australian government has confirmed it's looking at a tighter lockdown in parts of Melbourne that have been identified as new COVID-19 hotspots. Victoria has had to scrap plans to relax some COVID-19 restrictions because of a recent spike. The state has more than 100 active cases, including 17 new infections today. The ABC's Samantha Donovan has more.
The Federal Health Minister, Greg Hunt, says a spike in the number of coronavirus cases in particular areas has always been on the cards. He's told RN Breakfast he's keeping an eye on Melbourne's 6 hotspots.
The possibility of tighter lockdowns, as we did in northwest Tasmania, is on the table, and I think it's very important to be honest about that. However, we saw a drop in the number of cases between Saturday and Sunday. I'm looking at this morning's cases. They'll come in during the course of the next few hours. And if we are able to maintain low levels and low numbers, then I'm hopeful that we can avoid those lockdowns. But we have to be absolutely clear. The rings of containment, the local actions are on the table, and they've been part of our response right from the outset.
Worldwide, there's been a record jump in the number of infections. 183,000 cases reported to the World Health Organization overnight, the most in a single day. Its Director General, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, is warning that countries which have successfully suppressed transmission are now seeing an increase in case numbers as they reopen their economies.
All countries are facing a delicate balance between protecting their people while minimizing the social and economic damage. It's not a choice between lives and livelihoods. Countries can do both. Finding and testing suspected cases works. Isolating and caring for the sick works. Tracing and quarantining contacts works. And protecting health workers works.
Dr. Tedros says the disruptions brought by the virus will be felt for many years to come.
The world is learning the hard way that health is not a luxury item. It's the cornerstone of security, stability, and prosperity.
The pressure to resume flights and reopen hotels around the world is challenging health officials. The WHO says it's working with the travel industry to make things as safe as possible, and guidelines will be released in the next few days.
That report from the ABC's Samantha Donovan. Germany has called in the army to help respond to a major outbreak of COVID-19 at a meat processing plant that has seen more than 1,000 workers infected. Politicians are now calling on the owners of the plant, the biggest of its kind in Europe, to be held to account. CNN's Frederick Pleitgen reports.
Germany has called in its army after more than 1,300 workers at the Tönnies meat processing plant in the city of Gütersloh tested positive for the novel coronavirus. Local authorities ripped into management, saying in many cases the firm failed to provide the addresses of employees, even as health officials were urgently trying to trace those who may have been in contact with the virus. I want to say clearly that the trust we have in the Tönnies company is zero, the crisis team leader says. I have to say this clearly. While the company says German data protection laws slowed the information sharing process, the owner says he's sorry the outbreak occurred in his business. I can only offer my complete apologies and give my apology because we are the cause of this issue and carry full responsibility, me as a businessman and the company as a whole, he said. The outbreak in Gütersloh is one of the main reasons the reproduction number for the novel coronavirus in Germany has soared, the country's Center for Disease Control said. But it also spotlights what many activists and politicians say are unacceptable working conditions in German abattoirs, with employees often laboring and living in very close quarters. Germany has seen a series of outbreaks in its meat processing industry, and the government says it will take action to improve conditions. The federal government is determined not to be guided by the interests of lobbyists, but by the interests of the public, Germany's labor minister said. At its core, this is a decision between public well-being or egoistic interests. Meanwhile, in the town of Gütersloh, state authorities say they might have to put the entire region around the Tönnies plant under a blanket lockdown. The source of this outbreak can be found at this specific company, so it is still the case that we are unable to rule out a wider lockdown, the state governor said. While Germany has often been praised for its strong reaction to the coronavirus pandemic, politicians acknowledge they need to do more to make sure the meat industry here does not remain a source of heightened infections.
And that's the CNN's Frederick Pleitgen reporting there. Some feedback before we head off on border controls. Chris from Christchurch says border control is neither a shambles nor a cock-up. It is a complex and complicated process being implemented in a rapidly changing environment, and one for which there is no script. The government is reviewing and acting to close gaps as they are identified. And this person says Trans-Tasman bub, meaning the Trans-Tasman bubble, wait until summer. This person reckons COVID is less virulent at that time, and it'll be time then that we can see what is actually going on. And someone else has got in touch over the announcement that aircrew will now be tested and other people on our borders will be tested. I'm one of the Air New Zealand crew, and I'm absolutely delighted that incoming crew are now required to self-isolate until testing negative. Well done, they say. Catch you again tomorrow. Have a great evening.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. All air crews and airport workers are to be regularly tested for COVID-19, even if they have no symptoms. The insurance underwriter IAG plans to close all its 53 AMI stores. The police swooped on the Mongols gang in Bay of Plenty today and arrested 10 members who face hundreds of charges. The Associate Housing Minister, Chris Farfoy, has apologised to an Auckland family whose severely disabled son has been living in a garage because of a lack of suitable public housing. He's requested their case be expedited tomorrow. Those are the headlines. Our next news will be at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
The order doesn't give authority to, hold someone down and actually, shove a swab up someone's nose.
Lately with me, Karen Hayes, your late night eye on the latest headlines and the people who are making them.
Accessibility is, in a digital sense, it's the wheelchair ramps. Blind